Well, I cannot tell you how much pleasure it gives me to introduce Peter Fenwick, who is our next keynote speaker. Peter and I first met, I remember the date, he probably doesn't, but I remember that in 1987 we first met. And we've remained friends ever since. In fact, he's one of my dearest friends. He has friends all over the world, in fact, because once you meet Peter, you fall under his spell, which has nothing to do with power. It is to do with wisdom, and it is to do with understanding, and it is to do with compassion. He is not only a great scholar in his area, but he's also a very courageous man. Because, rather like Ian, in fact, he spent his career working in one of the hardest nosed of all fields, psychiatry, and in Peter's case, neuropsychiatry is well tacked on. And yet, both of them have stood out against the materialistic model. And they've done so not only because they believe that model is wrong, but because they believe it is harmful. And amazingly, Peter, in spite of this, is very, very popular, even with his hard-nosed colleagues. And I hope that he is convincing, or at least influencing some of them in their way of thinking. It's a real pleasure to have had Ian and Peter on the same day. And I think, although they're talking different topics, but I think you will see convergence between them. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David. That was really lovely. It's quite untrue, but it's really lovely. And thank you so much for the invitation to come here. You're an amazing bunch of... I was wanting another word for leaders, but leaders will do nicely. And opening up a totally new field. And the fact that an academic group such as the British Society of Psychologists should in fact include you amongst them, I think is an enormously important thing. And I see it as a growing edge. I mean, it's got to be, because we have to understand more about who we are and what we do. Now, I'm on the horns of dilemma. One horn is Ian, of course, because I have to be both right and left hemisphere. So I was checking off to see that I was right. Is there any humour? Yeah, I think it's a bit. Is there anything to do with empathy? Yeah, a bit. Is there anything that would be really right hemisphere? Yes. And of course I have to talk in metaphors. So I have to say my presentation to you is like a mountain. It's got peaks and it's got valleys. So I hope that that's okay, Ian. Now the other horn of the dilemma is David. David looked at me and he said, I've heard this 3 times and I could give it. All you have to do is fall down dead and you'll hear it and I'll be able to give it. Well, I'm not going to fall down dead. And just to spite David, I've changed it a bit, but not all that much. Okay, so the reason why I came to this was a very simple question. Having looked at how people how people are clinically dead in cardiac arrests, and the fact that 10% of people with cardiac arrests have near-death experiences, and that of that, 30% leave their bodies and watch the arrest procedure, they say. But the ones who come back and say they had a near-death experience in the cardiac arrest, remember, all the signs of clinical death, said that they have a very clear, lucid world. And if you know how people recover from cardiac arrests, it's a confusional arousal. So you're not going to be able to have this very clear view that they had. So it raises a question, how do we die? Now, I challenge any of you to go to the literature and find out what the mental states of the dying are. And it's just not there. So this is really where this came from. So, why have we not studied dying? How many of you have studied dying? How many of you got a lecture at school about dying? How many of you, when you will retire, will get a lecture about dying? None. Why not? Well, you say kids don't need it. But in fact, I give a lecture at a school, a couple of schools, and I ask the kids, how many of you have seen people die? And there are always 3 or 4 kids in the class. So it's something that needs to be addressed, but we don't seem to do it. And why do we not do it? Because we're really scared. And in fact, when we talk about dying, we always talk about somebody else's death. Yes, I remember so-and-so, God, he was lovely, somebody else's death. How many of you have said, when I die, I'm going to have a gravestone, and it's going to be like this, and I'm going to put it in the most wonderful coppice, and there are going to be these trees all around? None of you, do you? Why not? Because you're scared. And that's Freud's paradox. Yeah, you can be scattered without a tombstone, but at least you've thought about it. In fact, Freud's paradox says that when discussing death, we talk about other people's death, never our own. And that is true. Okay, see if you like this. Okay, you're scared. You're all scared of death. Few of us are prepared to look closely at death. How many of you this morning rolled up your loincloth, put it in the corner of your room, and set out expecting possibly to die? Not many. And in our culture, we really don't do death at all. I wrote an article for one of the London newspapers, and the letter I got back, or rather the information I got back, is, you see, we just don't do dying. It's so depressing. Yes, they do dying. What? Yeah, absolutely. And death is swept under the carpet. Actually, they did add, we do one article every 6 months. So is death the end of consciousness or the beginning of the journey? And it's something which we really need to look at. And so what is the evidence? We know that death is the shutting down of the body and the brain, but we know little about the dying process, the mental states of the dying. And so that's really what I set out to do. Okay, let's do a literature search. PubMed, good database. Deathbed Visions, 6. 2 are my papers, are papers. Deathbed Coincidences, 2, both are our papers. Death and Grieving, okay, you can see it's coming now across the border. Lots of papers. And Terminal Restlessness, again, there are at least 81 papers. But these types of things which happen at the end, there is very few. So why? So what we wanted to do was to look at end-of-life experiences, and these were the sorts of things we thought we'd like to look at. Deathbed visions, usually of dead relatives or dreams suggesting an onward journey. Transition to and from other realities, often involving love and light. Really interesting, that. Coincidences, awareness of the dying person by someone emotionally close but not physically present. And then phenomena around the time of death. Why should it happen? Keep these questions in your mind. Why? Phenomena around the time of death, such as clock stopping, odd animal behavior, mechanical malfunctions, shapes seen leaving the body, and light surrounding the body. So why? Do we know when we're going to die? Any of you know when you're going to die? No. The Dalai Lama says that we will do. We do. And what he said was you get premonitions 1 to 2 years before you die. Breathing will undergo a subtle change. You'll become more excited or depressed. You'll want more things or want to give them up. Your behavior will change. And if you listen at a very deep level, you may know you're going to die soon. And I suspect whether we can listen at that level or not, I don't know. And he also went on to say, and this is enormously important for our culture, those who reject death, and it seems to be that most of us in our culture do, you suffer from a false sense of permanence, which I pointed out that none of you rolled up your loincloths and put it in the corner expecting to die. You're all going to come back to your rooms. You become more greedy, more self-serving and lustful, have more enemies. You become attached to my wealth, my health, my friends, my enemies, and my family. There's no point in having enemies if you're going to die tomorrow. There's a lot of point in having enemies if you're going to stick around for a bit, then you can really get at them. So, no, that's the Dalai Lama. And preparation for death. Premonitions for death and preparations for death. Do we get premonitions? Yes, we do, and they're really quite interesting. This one is a story that a mother told me about her daughter. So this is the daughter speaking. Her husband was 25 and the couple had 2 young children, but he seemed to be preparing for death, which is interesting. He wrote his will and got his affairs in order and said that his work was complete. I'd like to know what that meant. It was now time for him to die. Well, being a psychiatrist, I know exactly what is going to happen. He's going to commit suicide, isn't he? But it wasn't like that at all. This situation continued for some months, and then one day his firm sent him on a trip abroad. The plane he was flying in crashed, and he's killed. He had a premonition that he was going to die. You get premonitions of others' death as well as your own. Here's one. My third daughter, Roberta, was just 7 years old on May the 17th. It's a sad little one, this. In 1989, when I woke up in the morning, totally upset and in mourning over her death. The reason it's spelt wrong is that this is her actual quote. I was so surprised and confused to see her lying next to me that I actually gently nudged her to see if she was alive. She'd apparently gotten up during the night and climbed in next to me. When she moved, I cried uncontrollably with relief that she was not dead and hugged her. She did not seem to mind or make any fuss, which is interesting. Perhaps she knew why I felt relief. I did not tell her I had thought that she was dead. I could not remember any dream, but the feelings were so strong and real, exactly as they were 2 days later when she was the victim of a hit-and-run accident. Really sad. Do you get premonitory visits by dead relatives? Yes, you do. My mother was in hospital after a fall and had fractured her ribs. One day she saw my dead brother at the door of her room. She said it made her very happy to see him. Now, why is she happy to see her dead brother? It's interesting, and you get this disjunction, this emotional incongruity. I joked that he had come to take her on to the next world, and we laughed about it. And 2 weeks later, she died unexpectedly. So these premonitory visits of dead relatives do occur. I thought that we'd look at now at changing deathbed rituals in recent times. And what I want to draw from this is the fact that we don't like death and we do hide it. George Washington, 1799, really nice. Family members, wife, children, servants, good deathbed. Napoleon in Elba apparently had his family around, some of his ex-generals. Death of Abraham Lincoln, much more the death of a statesman. Really, these are all statesmen and doctors, I think. There's nobody from his personal life there that you can see. And this is the family deathbed at home in Victorian times. And see what that's like. All the kids are there. The husband is there. Of course, all these kids know what death is, because probably their one or two of the siblings are going to have died from infections. And the mother, in fact, will quite often die in childbirth. So there is this huge awareness of death, which we've lost in our society now. And this is what we do now. I mean, do you really want to die like this? This trying to preserve life until the very last breath. And in fact, my niece has just died, and she died in an intensive care unit. And this is exactly what would happen to her. You get this very high technical stuff, and there's no real spiritual care for the people. They're just there, keep them alive, keep them alive, keep them alive. So we've got the balance wrong. So contemporary Western attitudes to death. Death is medicalized and banished from the home. Death is not natural. Instead, it's a medical failure. It is offensive and should occur in private. We don't die in public. Daily life is unmarked by death. And death is an embarrassment. Often the dying, bereaved, are isolated. And you've probably seen these feelings in yourself when you come up to somebody who's died, not certain what to say. And so because of it, one of my co-workers has written a book called The D Word to try and emphasize this. And of course, morticians will create the illusion of life right up to the last moment till they go into the grave. NHS spending, 32% of Britons fear dying alone. How many of you are afraid of dying alone? A third of you? Well, none of you are going to admit it, are you, after that? 56% of us will die in NHS hospitals. This is really sad. I mean, really sad. Have you ever seen anybody dying in an NHS hospital? The nurses don't have time for them. Why should they have? They've got a lot of seriously ill patients that need them, and somebody who's dying is dying. And that's why in NHS hospitals, more than 50% of complaints refer to care of the dying. It's really sad. However, we do have a palliative care section, and there are strengths and weaknesses. Physical care of the dying in hospices and hospitals is good. That's really good. Prolonging life, prolongation of life by medical services is very good. That's excellent. And pain relief is really excellent, and I'm pleased about that. But spiritual care of the dying is poor. Understanding of the mental states of the dying is almost absent. And carers are not trained in end-of-life experiences, and death is still considered a medical failure. So we've a long way to go. But there was, in the BMJ 2008, this article of compassion in care of the dying. And they pointed out that lack of compassion can negatively affect the welfare of patients. Well, we know that. Staff need to prepare relatives for the death of a patient and give them time to arrange for other family members to be present when they die. I mean, that's astonishing that this isn't done automatically. Patients may want to discuss how long they might live or what dying might be like. Well, most of them actually don't know what dying might be like because they're not trained. The physician who does my flying medicals for me, his wife got cancer, and so I was able to watch her treatment through his eyes. And he said that when she asked the palliative care physician exactly what it would be like to die and how long it might be, he was looking at her like this, and he turned away and he said, well, these are very difficult questions, now let's get on to something else. I mean, there was absolutely no empathy about that at all. And they are difficult questions, and one understands why he took this viewpoint, because we don't have this in our society at the moment. Sometimes staff do not understand or acknowledge the spiritual needs of the dying and find it hard to talk to them about these issues, and this is true and it's sad. Okay, so what I wanted to know is, do end-of-life experiences happen? Now you say, well, of course they happen because you were able to know about them, but that's not true. because if you look in the literature, you don't find it, but if you talk to people, then you do find it. So we did 3 studies. This one in Ireland was done by Una McColville independently of us and but used our questionnaire. The first one we did was in England, and we've now done the first bit of the study in Holland. So we've got 3 studies ongoing. These are my colleagues. Sue Brain, she read the D word. Hilary Lovelace, she's gone to New Zealand, lovely nurse, and we hope to do a study there amongst the Maoris. And this is Ineke Kodam from Holland, who's an experienced hospice worker, and so they've done the work for us. 70 carers have been questioned in Holland and England, and the figures that you'll see, and remember, are the percent of carers who've had it related. So it's a carer study. Why don't you ask the dying? How could I ask the dying when if I put into the ethics committee that I don't even know that these things occur? They're not going to let me ask the dying. So what we have to do is get some definition before you go to the dying. We question doctors, nurses, auxiliary staff, chaplains, and volunteers. And note from this that some of these people are not always with the dying, so may not have heard the stories. Questionnaire. Deathbed visions, deathbed coincidences, light surrounding the body at death. Did I really think that we'd get that? Well, yes, I did, but that was because somebody sent in an account from a near-death experience in response to a near-death experience program. And she told me what happened when her mother died. Shapes seen leaving the body at death, transiting to a new reality. This is all the questionnaire. Seeing from the corner of the eye, very important, in fact. Humming and singing just before death, carers' view of this phenomena, and then carers' training. And these last 2 are enormously important. Okay, our data sets were, we did a 5-year retrospective and a 1-year prospective in the UK. We've done the 5-year retrospective in Holland. We set up our questionnaire with a palliative care team to make sure that we got the questions formulated properly. Then we did the study in 2 English hospices and 2 Dutch hospices and 1 nursing home. And then there's this 1 independent study in hospices in Ireland. And then I was very fortunate to be asked, after Elizabeth and I had written our book, to talk on Richard and Judy. It's a lovely, lovely program to talk on. It's really great. And Richard has had a number of these experiences in his family, so he's very sympathetic. And he wanted it to go on. And in one of our interviews, he actually took the thing, his producer was shouting at him, cut it. And he took the earphone out, and we got a few extra minutes. But that produced lots of nice emails of experiences. Then Danny Penman in the Daily Mail, his articles produced more, and I've written articles in some papers to get experiences. And then radio in the UK and the USA. The best one in the USA is Coast to Coast. I don't know if any of you have been on it. Have you? It's really good, actually, isn't it? You get 3 hours. 3 hours. I mean, it's just lovely. And it's got a 10 million audience. It's fantastic. And so we got a lot of emails from them. So that's our database. So we're very data rich. Do you see? We've got over 1,000 experiences that we can look at and draw on. And so we can start to answer some of these questions now. Do end-of-life experiences occur? Well, the answer to that is yes, they do. I want you to look at this bar, this is percent of carers. And you can see that nearly 90% of carers in the last 5 years had these 1 to 5 stories related to them. So they're not uncommon. In the prospective study, about 45% had it 1 to 5 in the last year. But note that there's 5% here with 5 to 10, and then there's this big one at the end. So some people get more stories related to them, and I think this is a personality thing. And so they're in the 10 to 20 bracket. So we can say from this straight away, yes, these things do occur and not uncommonly. So what are they like? These are deathbed visions, and they're very comforting. Here's some of our data. Those deathbed visions, and there's 60-70% retrospective, Dutch retrospective, English prospective, and they're all in the same sort of area. So yes, you do get these things, but look at this one. Does the deathbed vision sit on your bed? Yes, they do. They've heard stories about the deathbed vision sitting on your bed. So you want to set up a filter as to who you want to come sit on your bed with you and look after you when you die. Here's a picture of Mary. She's dying, and look, she's got some nice angels, but nothing like this. This is the Giotto fresco from St. Francis of Assisi's tomb, and he can look at that. I mean, would you all love this? Wonderful. Coming down just at the last moment before you die. I'd like it anyway. And here's some of the stories. When I was working as a district nurse, I used to visit an 80-year-old lady once a week. She eventually became weaker, was semi-conscious, only reacting to painful stimuli. She died, and I visited her next day to help. Her daughter said that she was lying peacefully and suddenly sat bolt upright with a beaming smile on her face and said, "Joe, how nice of you to come and see me." Joe was her deceased husband. Again, do notice the incongruity, really, or the fact that she's just about to die and her dead husband comes. The matrix of death is very different from the matrix of life, and I think you have to understand that. Joe was her deceased husband, and she lay back down again and died soon after. The daughter was very sensible and practical and really believed that her father had visited. It's another. My father was terminally ill with cancer. Just a couple of days before his death, my grandmother died suddenly, but we did not tell my father, as he had been very close to his mother-in-law and did not want to upset him. Okay, so he doesn't know that his mother-in-law has died. As he was passing away, he turned to my mother and said, "Your mum is here. What on earth is she doing here?" He then smiled and died. I think the fact that my father could not possibly have known that his mother-in-law was dead makes this experience all the more interesting and, to my mind, convincing of an afterlife. So there's a linkage there, and it's a really interesting linkage. And the name of the person, the physician who did this, was somebody or other. Barrett, was it, in 1920?
Yes,
William Barrett. And he started the first study on this, and that was one of his findings which made him think that it was real. His old friends, I remember one evening we were sitting with him talking quietly. He was too ill to contribute much to the conversation, but liked to hear us chatting, when suddenly he leaned forward and stared across the room, became very animated and looked very happy as he began to talk to people he could obviously see, but we couldn't. He was calling them each by name and asking how they were and how wonderful it was to see them again. It became apparent from what he was saying they were some of the men who had served with him at the Somme and died there. There was a look of wonderment on his face, and he forgot his pain. Do understand this transformation that goes on as you die. These are not hallucinations in the sense of something being just airy-fairy. They're very real people who come to you at that time. And the other important point is that when they come, your language changes and you go into journeying language, which you may not have done before. I joined my daughter after an hour at the hospital, and we both sat chatting to my mother. She spoke to me about my life and my future, all interspersed with references to these people who were now at the end of her bed. She told us that she wouldn't be there the next day, as these people would pick her up when she fell and take her on a journey. We were slightly spooked at her comments, but she was totally at ease. She insisted that we shouldn't cry when she died. We then left her and said we'd return later on Christmas Eve. And the story goes on. By that time, in fact, she had died. But they go into journeying language. I'm going on a trip. I won't be here. I'll be collected. I'll go with. Do you see? It all changes after they've had these visits. Cultural elements, well, after what you've heard from Ian this morning, you know there've got to be cultural elements because they're the filter you see things through. There are very few studies of these. Probably the best one is Osis and Harrelson in 1977. And they looked at Americans and Indians, and you want to see the 70% who are the apparitions of the dead or the deathbed visions that we've been talking about with family members. only 29% in the Indians. They have a huge number of religious figures, 50%, as opposed to 10% in America. So there is a cultural frame through which you see this. And I suggest to you that you should really make a decision who you want to come and be there, and then set it up. And the chances are you'll probably get it. Are they just hallucinations? Well, we know what a hallucination is. There's a nice paper just come out by April Mazzarino-Willett, and she asked exactly the same question, and she went back to the literature and took out the difference in the phenomena between deathbed visions and hallucinations. And she makes a very good case for them being quite different, and particularly in the response to the person who's dying. Calm, peaceful state in the one who's dying with deathbed visions, frightened, agitated, paranoid, hallucinations, and so it goes on, months to moments before death, any time during the dying process. Humanoids or humans, angels, religious icons, dead relatives, friends, predominantly auditory, but can be visual insects, snakes, and so on. And so there is a difference in the form of the deathbed vision and the ordinary hallucination. Now, we did an analysis of 118 visions and asked a number of questions. And the first one was, who do the dying see? Well, 24% of this sample saw their parents. Note the persons unknown are quite common, but they, in fact, are usually spiritual people. Greetings, joyful, and no response. And this is very common. Just before you die, you will probably sit up, look at it, we'll talk about it a bit in a moment, and greet something and respond emotionally to it, but you may be too weak to talk, 14%, other relatives and so on. But we don't have many angels in our culture. John Lerner in Houston, who's also started to write about this, has a lot of angels down there. We don't have angels here. Perhaps the Pope's right. Perhaps we're aggressively secular, do you think? And that's why we don't get many angels. You don't get many friends either. It's mainly relatives. I thought it was going to be my mum. Yes, it will be your mum, don't worry. So who sees these? Well, the dying, obviously. Very rarely others in the room, and especially children. This is in our sample. Very, very rarely hospice or hospital staff. So that's mainly the dying, but of course as soon as hospital staff start seeing them and children start seeing them, then they become much more veridical because other people can see them. Now, how do they come? They often come into the room shortly before death. They'll stand around or sit on the deathbed in the room. It's really interesting, having people sitting on the deathbed. Would I like my angel to sit there? Yeah, I think I might. Appear to be in real space as the dying direct their gaze and comments to a particular place. Maybe more than one person. Occasionally unknown people wait at a distance and come closer as death approaches. And there are nice accounts of people being outside the hospice and then coming closer and closer and closer as death approaches. And they're usually spiritual people. Why do they come? And that's an interesting question. They say, the dying say, that the relatives say they come to greet them, to reassure them that they'll be with them, to tell them when it's time to go, to take them on a journey. They can be negotiated with and time of death delayed for a short while. You can only do it for a short while. I mean, there's no point in saying, actually, I've just got this business deal to get through and so on. They won't take that, but they will. If you say, I've got this person, my son's coming over from Australia, and I'd like not to be collected tomorrow, but in 3 days when he comes, then they'll do that for you. But not much more than that. You can go home to see your garden. Some people want to go home and see their gardens before they die. That's a very nice request, and the relatives would allow that. My sister, his delaying tactics. My sister heard Dad talking very crossly to someone in his room. Fearing that one of her children had gone in and upset him, she went in to see what was going on. Only Dad was there in his bed. My sister asked him who he was talking to, and he replied, I was telling the angels that I was not ready to go yet. He knew I was coming, was determined to stay alive until I had seen him. Lovely piece of refusal to go, but you do go. He's refusing to die as a protest against inheritance tax. It's not going to work, guys. All right, I want to move away from deathbed visions now to another of the phenomena which has enormous consequences for neuroscience. It's really interesting. And this is when unconscious, very weak, or demented patients suddenly alert and sit up just before they die to say goodbye to relations and often to welcome dead relatives. And it has this sort of pattern. My father had been unconscious for a day or so when he appeared to become uncomfortable, and the nurse increased the flow of IV analgesia. Approximately 30 minutes or less after the drip had been increased, Dad sat up in the bed, did not move arms or legs. To sit up took no effort, and this is repeated throughout these observations. They just sit up, and people do things they haven't done for years. So he sat forward. He had an incredulous expression, eyes and mouth open as in disbelief. Mum assumed he could see someone at the foot of the bed. After a few seconds, he gently sank back on the pillow, and he died. And this is the quality of it, this sudden burst of energy before. And another one. My brother was in hospital dying from emphysema. His breathing was very labored, when all of a sudden he stopped and his breathing suddenly appeared normal. It's interesting, this. He looked at about 45 degrees upwards and smiled broadly as if at something or someone. He turned to me and died suddenly in my arms. It's really just before death. I'm positive to this day that he wanted to tell me what he'd seen. Those few seconds before he died will live with me forever. It was so powerful. And this is one of the qualities of these end-of-life experiences, is that they, in fact, do help the grieving process. Now, this is just coming over the horizon. This is a paper by Michael Nahm, Bruce Grayson, chronic schizophrenia and dementia. And what he was looking at was, in the German literature, a lot of these examples are taken from. And there he's looking at what happens to demented patients. But we've got the same thing from people in the nursing home. He got 81 cases, 49 case reports, and it's essential reading for every neuroscientist, because this is the sort of data. And if you think about it, if it's really like this, it's enormously interesting. The deaf-mute man was educated in a special school for deaf-mute persons, but still never managed to speak understandably because of an organic defect. Yet, in the elation of the last hours, he's able to speak comprehensively for the first time in his life. That's a really interesting thing, if in fact it's true. And certainly we've got accounts of people who've been demented for many years with Alzheimer's, but yet in the terminal lucidity period, they sit up as they're dying, recognize their relatives, say goodbye, probably agree to deathbed vision, and then go. So there's something very special happening at that time. So terminal lucidity is before death, and I just want to talk about the way that our understanding of death is just beginning to expand a bit more. But there are changes in cerebral activity just after death, and that may be important and could carry ethical implications and questions for consciousness research. So this is what happens when you die, and it all started by Chihuahua in 2009. And he saw surges in the electroencephalogram at the time of death. And this is what he saw. He used something called a BIS monitor. This is a bispectrum analyzer. What it does, it takes the EEG and combines it in an interesting mathematical way. And this is the actual BIS monitor itself. It's got a scale down there. And awake and alert is there, and death is there. And it's used in anesthesia, because you like to keep your patients somewhere along there, not right down at the bottom. You put electrodes on, they're very easy. You can go to your patient, push them on, and so you're looking at the EEG activity from the frontal region. This is the sort of high-tech environment where people in intensive care now die. And in the studies I'm showing you, they had an arterial line probably in their arm, so that they could tell when the heart had stopped and the blood pressure had gone. And this is what he found. The BIS was going along. I'm not quite sure what he was doing so high. At any rate, at this point, they died. And this is the blood pressure. The blood pressure goes down with this. Then after they have actually died, you get this huge peak in cerebral activity. And he showed this, or they showed this, in a number of cases. So just after you've died, you get this peak. Now, the question is, how broad is this? It can go up to 15 minutes after you've died. So this is enormously interesting in understanding our concept of death. This was taken a step further by Ouyang and his co-workers. And he was looking at during organ donation after cardiac death. Now, what happens is you've been defined as being going to be a donor, you're not going to live, you're brain dead, etc., etc. And then it's time for everything to be switched off. And at this point, there it's switched off. The BIS is going along very low. And there, of course, you're dead. Now, this person got a quarter of an hour surge in activity in his brain after everything had been switched off. And at this time, he would probably, in fact, have been taken along to have his kidneys removed. So what is going on here? The argument is that you get massive depolarization due to the anoxia of cells within the brain, particularly deep in the brain, and this drives the cortex. But until one actually has a much better understanding of it, one doesn't know whether in fact they're conscious inside while somebody's hacking out their kidney at the other end. And the other thing is that it also points to the importance of leaving the body alone after it's died, because we actually don't yet properly understand death. So terminal lucidity has consequences for neuroscience, so it's an interesting new area. So where do the dying go? Well, if you want to know where the dying go, ask them. They'll tell you. And they go to new realities. There you are. In the prospective study in England, it's almost the same as the retrospective in Holland, because people were beginning to understand what this meant. And they go into reality, which is very much like that, the near-death experience. My father was my grandfather's bedside, deeply distressed. My grandfather quietly said to my father, "Don't worry, Leslie, I'm all right. I can see and hear the most beautiful things, and you must not worry." And he quietly died, lucid to the end. Now, we have a lot of these ones where they, in fact, are able to describe where they're going. And there's a wonderful splitting of consciousness. They transit to this new area, back to the hospice, new area, back to the hospice. We've got accounts of people coming back again and saying, "Oh, am I still here?" And so they've got this splitting in terms of consciousness and where they go. I was nursing my friend who had definite views that there was no afterlife, so she's not expecting anything. In her last couple of hours, she became very peaceful and arose from her unconsciousness, periodically saying clearly and happily such phrases as, "I will know soon, come on, get on with it then. I'm ready to go, and it is so beautiful." She would immediately lapse back into unconsciousness after uttering these phrases. She's very obviously content, happy, and at peace. It was a wonderful experience for her partner and me. So you get this idea of transition in the death journey. So the new reality is very like the NDE world, love, light, and compassion. Waiting area with spiritual beings is quite often described, and of course dead relatives are present. So let's leave that and go on to the next area, which is deathbed coincidences. Totally fascinating, absolutely fascinating. They're a visit initiated by the dying person at the moment of death to someone of great emotional significance to him or her, and distance is no barrier. So the dying initiated, it's the dying's feast. They're the people who initiate the visits, and they go. Do they occur? Yes, they do. In about 50% of the carers have noted it. So they're quite common, and we get loads of accounts of these, and they're like this. There you are, you're dying in Florida. A close friend or relative is, of course, in the UK, and there is this communication between the two of you at the moment or around the time of, but practically at the moment of death. There's this linking, and it's driven by the person who's dying. One morning around 1950, my father and I had to visit a distant relative, Kate, to tell her that her brother had died the previous day. Nice Scottish one for you. She lived in a remote part of East Ross and was not on the telephone, so she couldn't have known. When Dad and I arrived at the farmhouse, we were met by Kate, who said, "I know why you've come. I heard him calling me, saying, 'Kate, Kate,' as he passed over." So note that she knew that he was dying at that point. She was quite matter-of-fact about it and gave us the time of death, which was exactly the same as that recorded by the hospital. I found it an amazing experience and never forgotten it, nor will I ever. I was about 17 at the time. But note that Kate was awake, and deathbed coincidences, how you receive the message depends on your mental state. They initiate it, but it's the mental state of the person. Here's one if you're asleep. 2 days after diving, this is a submariner, submarine guy. 2 days after diving, I was asleep in bed and had a very real dream that my grandfather had died. So they come in dreams. All our family was waiting in the place where our grandparents had lived, and that I was the last one to arrive. When I arrived, my grandfather saw that we were all there. He picked up my nephew's bike and said, "That's it, I'm off," and pedaled off over a walkway and disappeared. So it's a nice image. Whilst on patrol, submariners are never told of any bad news. It was not until 3 weeks later that the captain told me that my paternal grandfather had passed away at approximately 3 a.m. on the 18th of October, 1987. I had no idea that he'd been ill. At the time of his death, I was fast asleep 200 feet below the Atlantic Ocean. Very spooky. Spooky indeed it is. So we wanted to get more idea of this, so we analysed 30 emails, and 90% of these were first-hand, and the others came from first-degree relatives. The features was the relationship to the dying person. 80% first-degree relative of the dying person. Granddaughters and grandmothers made up the largest sample. They were obviously closest. Grandmothers tend to go and tell their granddaughters, but we've 9 grandsons and 1 granddaughter, rather 8 grandsons and 1 granddaughter. So she's got to find the granddaughter when she dies, my wife, that is. Verification, 93% verified as occurring at the time of death, so it's a good sample. But the same proportion in that's place of death. Death was, and this is the really interesting one, death was unexpected in 44% of cases and expected in 37%. Everybody says, well, they were expecting it, no wonder they heard it. It's not true. Half the sample didn't. 27% were said to be ill, 17% to be dying. But this is the other interesting one. Only 11% reported this in violent, swift accidents. So it actually doesn't matter how you die, whether you die in a hospice slowly or whether you die in an accident. You're still likely to go and see somebody, I expect, if you want to. The features, the circumstances, now do look at this, 7% in the morning and 10% in the afternoon, and 79% at night. Now, you know when most people die, when your cortisol levels are at their lowest, and that's circadian driven, and so most people die at night. So that's a nice internal consistency in the data. The experiencer described themselves as awake in 35, asleep in a third. Well, it's asleep in nearly 2/3. The recipient was alone at the time of receiving the message in 69%, but you can get it if you're with other people, obviously. And this is the other interesting one. A quarter of our sample, people were abroad. In other words, the message had transferred across continents. So what's the effect of the coincidences? Practically everybody who sent us in one said that they were enormously comforting to them. And it's usually because they came with a message. And the message was that they were dying, but they're okay. And it's the fact that they're all right which is so comforting. So let's move on now for another set of phenomena which occur at the time of death. Clocks stop. I've always been interested in this. Animals respond, machines malfunction, light surrounds the body and shapes are seen leaving the body. And I'll do these very quickly with you. I'm fascinated by shapes seen leaving the body. What is it? Do we have a cultural frame we put onto it? Does something happen? I don't know. But the Tibetans have a very precise set of features as consciousness leaves the body. And what we've found approximates that in the most interesting way. Gail came in to tell us Anik had died, and we sat around the bed quietly. What I saw then was totally unexpected. Again, it's not expectation. Above Anik's bed, the air was moving, rather like a heat haze you see on the road, but swirling around. As my father, died, something which is very hard to describe because it was so unexpected and because I'd seen nothing like it, left up through his body and out of his head. It resembled distinct, delicate, wavy lines of smoke. Smoke's not the right word, but I had not got a comparison, and then disappeared. I was the only one to see it. It left me with such a sense of peace and comfort. Now, those are two. The wavy lines, like heat haze, that's the first stage of the Tibetan one, which is a mirage. The next stage of the Tibetan one is smoke. Then you get sparks at the bottom of wok. We've got some like that. Then you see a butter lamp flame flickering, and we've got some flickery ones. And then you go unconscious, and then you see an orange sky, a white sky, and so on. You go through the death process. But the first stages that we've got is very similar to what the Tibetans say. Okay, radiant light, I told you I was interested in. The Dutch see it much more than we do, even when we know about it. That's about 50% of people have radiant light surrounding. Carers report radiant light surrounding the body. It's fascinating. So light at death. Suddenly I was aware that her father was stood at the foot of her bed. My mother was staring at him too, and her face was lit up with joy. It was then that I saw her face appeared to be glowing with a gold light. The light began to leave through the top of her head and go towards the ceiling. Looking back to my mother's face, I saw she's no longer breathing. So this transformation at the time, but you can get it in many different forms. The whole room can be flooded with this light. Sometimes some people see it and others don't. But if you do see it, and if you go into it, then it's composed of what you would expect, love and compassion. Really interesting. Clocks. Pierce Bridge, where the story took place, and you all remember my grandfather clock, stopped dead, never to go again. Do you all remember that song? Well, it was an American songwriter who heard the story about this clock when the one brother died. Sorry, when the first brother died, it went slow. When the second brother died, it stopped dead, never to go again. And that's why we call these grandfathers' clocks. They call them long case clocks on the continent. On the morning of my mother's death, I'd wound her clock, of which she was very fond. You see there's a linkage, interesting linkage, and put it to the right time before going to work. While at work, a nurse phoned to tell me that my mother had died at 10 minutes to 11 that morning. She had not expected to die that day. She had not been expected to die that day, and I was very upset that I had not been with her. I drove straight home, and the first thing I saw on entering the house was the clock had stopped at 10 minutes to 11 exactly. We got a lot of these ones. They do stop: watches, clocks, mechanical clocks, electrical clocks, and so on. 21 years later, it's still going strong on my mantelpiece. Interesting. Okay, mechanical malfunction. Again, this is in the room of the dying. The TV screen went totally blank. And essentially, when his dad took the last breath, the television started malfunctioning, and a short while later it returned to normal. And they talked to the nurse about it, and she said that alarms are going off. This happens all the time when somebody is passing. So there is something going on actually in the death room itself in terms of the effects of dying on equipment around them. And then this one I love, 1954. Just think about this. Imagine, in fact, that you're flying in the Virgin aeroplane, and just put Virgin aeroplane instead of communication equipment here. 1954, during the Cold War, I was serving in the RAF at one of the chain home radar watch units, which protected our coastline. One bank holiday weekend at exactly 11 p.m., the switchboard shut down, the mains power and the emergency power supply cut out. A very serious break in the radar network, so nothing was working. At 11:30, the power returned. A complete check found no fault. But next morning, the station commander received a telegram saying that one of the operators who had gone home on leave had been taken suddenly ill and died the previous night at 11 o'clock. So make sure that you don't have a pilot who's just gone and had a heart attack while you're flying in his aeroplane. I love that one. I got it off the internet. A mystic Mog. Well, of course, you would expect that cats and dogs and birds, etc., are all influenced as well, and indeed they are. And in the New England Journal of Medicine, there's this story about cats who used to go onto the beds of the people who are dying. And this is one which comes to us from St. Peter's Hospice in Bristol. And we, in fact, have got 4 of these. And so cats seem to know when people are going to die. Birds come into it, they fly around the room, they come in. I mean, it's the most amazing story. This bird, a jackdaw, came in, walked up the garden, into the kitchen, straight past the cat, which took no notice at all. It looked at my mum, squawked, and then left. It's all a bit odd and not something you can easily discuss with people as they think you're mad. Indeed they do. So you've got lots of bird stories. Robins are very, very common. So, summary, using the death data, premonitions at the beginning. It's just a cartoon I made for you. Deathbed visions, shortly before dying, you can negotiate hope and joy. Then there's the journey and the transit to new realities, and terminal lucidity just before you die. And then you die, deathbed coincidences where you go and tell your relative you're okay. And you get clocks, animals, bells, lights, and shapes leaving the body all at the time of death. And then you go on your journey to elsewhere. So that's a sort of summary of it. But I'm seeing this more and more as a process of death. It's a process that we step into. And I like to think of it as the beginnings of the loosening of consciousness right back here. It's something like that. At any rate, it's all very much a process. So the conclusion to these studies, ELLIs are not uncommon. There's a spiritual language of the dying. Patients are frightened to talk about them. Carers do not discuss ELLIs between themselves. It's amazing. These lovely things going on in the hospices, but they won't talk about it. Carers do not have training in this area and find it difficult to respond to patients who want to talk to them. So you say to them, my dead grandmother has just come to see me, and they say, don't worry, dear, it's only the drugs you're having, it's okay. But I mean, what they want is validation. Isn't that wonderful? What did she say? And they say, going on the journey. God, that's really great. And this is the training. We did a seminar with some this is from the questionnaire. Nearly 100% want more training in this area. And in the prospective study, very, very few of them got any training at all. Mainly the training they got comes from us. Because of that, and there are a number there on the desk which you can take if you want, and if you want more, I can give them to you because they've been funded by Juliet and Peter Kindersley. Zen and Life Experiences, a guide for carers of the dying. We sent out over 2,000 of those to hospices, nursing homes, and primary care trusts. We didn't think that there was a decent account of how you die. So we wrote Nearing the End of Life, a guide for relatives and friends of the dying, and we sent out 2,000 of those as well. And people write in for them, and these were funded by the AIM Foundation, and again are free. So it's trying to raise the awareness of what actually happens when you die. And of course, there's our book. I hope you all have a copy. We asked the publisher to make it very cheap. And we have just 1 or 2 copies here, only £8, very cheap. But the point about it is that it actually does show you how you die and what the things about dying are, and raises it a bit. Now, I want to end with just talking about this bit. This is the spiritual bit before we die. So we've had all the fireworks and what dying consists of. Now let's talk about the actualities of it. And these are the final meaning end-of-life experiences that help the person process unresolved business so they can die peacefully. And they include a personal life review. You may well get a life review. And a huge desire for reconciliation. And you must make certain, if you're associated with hospices, that that can take place. A desire to put their affairs in order. And then brief lucidity in a confused or semi-conscious patient, enabling them to say their farewells. That's the terminal lucidity. And the ability to hang on to life until someone special comes. So those are the things which are important. Now we need to think about a good death. You should be able to die where you want. You should be able to die at home if you want to, in special spiritual units, or in special spiritual hospital units that really aren't these at the moment, and we do need them. And they should have special qualities to them, and the warmth of love must be the central characteristic of the unit. And in fact, I have found such a unit, and I'd love to go and die there. It's in Rotterdam. It's in such a house, a small hospice called De Veer Vogel, the Four Birds. And it's staffed by two wonderful nurses. And one of them is Simone de Kuyper, and the other one is Suzanne van Westerbrugge. And they run this hospice, and it's absolutely lovely. They confirm that the phenomenology we've been talking about today regularly occur in their hospice, which is a lovely validation. They describe a strong emotional pulse of love felt in the room of the dying, more particularly just as they're coming up to death. When somebody dies, they strike Tibetan chimes to celebrate the passing. And finally, a candle is lit for the relatives to take home. They're the three birds, and the fourth one is flying away, which is their name. So what is a good death? Good death simply means the person has died as he or she wanted. Very important. The opportunity to talk about fears they may have about dying, or if they've had ALIs, to have them validated. The chance to settle unfinished business and say farewell. The ability to choose the time to die, either alone or with the family present. Reconciliation is terribly important. My father and I had never got on, and I had left home at the age of 16 and never gone back. One day on my way to work, I had a sudden need instead to head north for home. When I arrived, Mum came rushing out in tears. My father was dying of cancer. They had not been able to get in touch with me. I made my peace with my dad, who said now he'd seen me. He was ready to go. And he died that night. It's terribly important, Dad. Now, this is from Maria de Hennesel's book, Intimate Death, and she was the first psychologist in the first hospice in Paris, and she was there at the death of Mitterrand. And her book's a lovely book. And these are some of her quotes. You can be clear-headed about the approach of death and yet stay absolutely alive until death comes. I'm not a believer, but I'm curious to know what happens next. And that's me, I think. I'm really curious to know. Confidence in the unfolding of things is more important than a belief that may not be rooted in deep inner trust. So it's confidence in the unfolding. It is not faith, but the texture of a life lived that allows one to give oneself into the arms of death. So what happens when we die? I'm going to take here the example of an air traffic controller, Alan Pring, who had the deepest near-death experience that I know, where he was about to merge with the universe.
I got into the habit when I'm talking to my wife and knowing that I'm coming to do this. That's the answer. One. Not my finger. One. That's all there is. There is no you, there is no me, there is no God. You are part of, we are, everything. It's one. You're one part. Forever and ever. It changes. It wouldn't matter to me if the scientists are right, and they probably are, that the universe began from the Big Bang from a singularity. It may or may not collapse back. It doesn't matter. It's one whole. We are part of it. It always has been. Always will be. There is no creator. It's one.
So let's end then with final quote. Dying is a spiritual process, and the exit of consciousness is poorly understood and neglected, and it is a process of love. One does not and this is the final quote by André Gide, one does not discover new lands without consenting to lose sight of the shore for a very long time. Thank you for your attention.
I first became interested in near-death experiences and, of course, in survival, as many of you know. Really, I suppose the interest has always been there, but I began to find the literature in about 1968, 69, 70, when I came upon the work of Dr. Krukel, who collected so many of these cases and wrote about half a dozen books, all of which I've read. And since then, I've read, I think, virtually everything of value, every serious book that has been published, containing case studies, containing rationale, and so on. Also, Deathbed Visions. Peter mentioned Sir William Barrett's book, written in about 1890, I think. And Deathbed Visions have been reported ever since. Peter's book and Elizabeth's book I can recommend as the best single book that you could buy on death and dying and near-death experiences, Deathbed Visions. It is bang up to date. Much of the data has been collected by Peter and his colleagues. It is beautifully written, and it makes a very, very strong case for the continuation of death, but particularly, as Peter has also made clear, on the importance of dying and how to die. It is said in the old shamanic traditions, one should always make a friend with one's death. That is, one should live with the awareness of death throughout life and not be afraid, because one day it's going to happen, and if you are afraid, then you live your life in fear. If you befriend your death, then when death comes, you'll be ready for it. Peter, there is a little bit of time for questions. That was a wonderful presentation. I think it's about the third time I've heard it as well. And I always learn something new every time. And I learn much from your beautiful way of presenting these facts.
Well, thank you very much. What I'd like to do, David, is to take you to my publisher. And then you can say all that.
To your patient.
Publisher.
I do reckon, I mean, The Art of Dying, this is a masterpiece. Really, if you can spare £8, go and buy it. And if you can spare a little bit more as well, buy Ian's book. You will never regret it. Right, we've got just a little bit of time for questions. Please keep them very short so that Peter can deal with as many as possible. He's here until tomorrow, so there will be an opportunity to chat to him. Mike?
Yeah, hi, Daniel. It's fascinating stuff, and I'm interested. You made the connection particularly at the end there with near-death experiences, and clearly there are a lot of parallels between the deathbed experience, deathbed visions, and near-death experience. But what I'm also aware of is there seem to be some differences between those two experiences. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. For example, there don't seem to be any out-of-body experiences in what you're talking about. The tunnel doesn't seem to be there explicitly in what you were talking about today. And the experiences with relatives and a near-death experience, that kind of comes at the end, it seems, at the end of the tunnel, whereas here it's happening in advance of death. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts on why there might be those differences.
There certainly are those differences. As you said, we've never seen somebody who's gone down a tunnel But the experience, the way that it comes on is different. In the near-death experience, there is the event, and you go down the tunnel, and then it develops, and it has a fairly fixed format. In these, it's much more driven by you going into another area and coming back again. You don't get this reciprocal function in the near-death experience. When you come back, it's always like that. The out-of-body experience, probably, I certainly haven't had anyone report one, so let's assume for the moment it doesn't occur. And I think, again, this is due to the process of the development of the near-death experience, because the first thing that happens in about 30% of the 10% of cardiac arrest cases is that they do have this out-of-body experience. It's very specific, and they tend to remain within the room, and then they go down the tunnel. So this journey out is something that you get in the near-death experience, but you don't get in the actual death experience itself, or just the premonitory death experience. Then the accounts we have is that you don't go into the light, but what you do, you seem to go into a sort of area where there are spiritual beings and a lot of light and a lot of love and a lot of compassion, and it's within those that the relatives are, so they do have a different structure to them. And I think part of it is to do with the actual matrix of death itself. I think it's quite different from the live person coming back in the near-death experience from somebody who, in fact, is in the process of losing, their consciousness is loosening and going. I think the idea of loosening consciousness through the death process is going to become more important.
Just to add something to that, because it's often assumed from the near-death literature that this is what is going to happen to us when we die. And it seems from what you're saying it's actually not. Something else is going to happen.
It's not, although the area seems to be approximately the same. But none of the relatives wave you back. Back, guys, not your time yet. Come, they said. We've got it right.
I would really love to hear a dialogue between Ian and Peter, looking at this whole area and the links and interchanges between their two talks today. That would be a revelation. Just one more question, but please make it short, and that gives Peter proper time to answer. Ian? Yeah, hang on.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation, which I did very much enjoy and learnt a lot from. I suppose in the previous session, the discussion was about how to make things scientifically sort of robust. And so I suppose, acting slightly advocatus diaboli, did you look at where experiences like this occurred, but they had nothing to do with death? From my own experience, my father died this year. 40 years ago, I had a very vivid dream in Italy that he had died, which was extraordinarily realistic. And I waited until the post office opened and rang him. Actually, he was perfectly well and was for 40 years. Equally, 2 years before he died, he had hallucinations. He saw his sister sitting on a sofa and smiling at him, and then she just disappeared. But also a little girl that he didn't know at all, who just came in and he just laughed about it. He had Parkinson's disease, and I think people get these hallucinations, so not all hallucinations are necessarily horrifying. And finally, in my house in Scotland, very often when I'm sitting in the drawing room, a bat comes in and flies around. Am I about to die?
That's absolutely right. I'd be very careful about that bat. No, we have a daughter who rings us up in the middle of the night and says, I've had this terrible dream and you're about to die. And we say, well, actually, no, not quite. Not yet, anyway. So that's why I thought it was important to analyze the actual experiences. And these are all ones which occur at the time of death. They occur awakening and when you're asleep in the form of dreams. And quite often the messages which are given are very specific. We had a lovely one from a guy he was the person who died in the UK, and his mum was in Australia. And she describes, as far as she knows, he's perfectly well. He's about 25. And she sees him coming down a sort of area in her dream, dripping wet. And as he comes closer to her, he becomes suffused by light. And he says to his mum, he's okay, she's not to worry, and then he goes. And she wakes up, of course, and tries to find out whether anything has happened to him, because it always comes with a very, very strong message that somebody has just died. And she found that her son, in fact, had died at exactly the time of the dream, in a boating accident. He'd been drowned. And so there are individual features like that which validate the experience and tie it into the moment. I think one of the most important points about the experience is their compelling nature, which we didn't go into. But we've got a lot of experiences where people have to do it. I mean, you talked a little bit about this. They have to go and ring up, particularly during the day. And in the other experience, and the other thing in the experience is the quality and nature of the message. The message is, I have just died, I am okay. Now, I expect in none of yours did you, in fact, get the imperative to act and to be socially inappropriate in your acting. In other words, you'd leave a party or you'd go and do something. And then to know that your father had died, and then to also know that he was okay. And then, of course, you get the validation of this with the time of death. So is this a subset of ordinary experiences, which we've just tied into the time of death, or are they different in some way? I think they're different in some way from the ordinary ones. I don't know. I shall go and bug my daughter, at any rate, when I die.
When my mother was nearing the end of her life, she was still in her own home, not on drugs, perfectly lucid, absolutely no mental problems at all. She said to me on more than one occasion, perhaps several occasions, she used to say when I went to visit her, David, who are all these other people in the room? Very much as Peter has just described to us. And then towards the end of her life, when she was in a care home, she said to me, David, who is that woman standing at the end of the bed? And of course, on each occasion, I said, well, it's very interesting, Mother, can you describe them to me? And took the experience as real and talked to her about it. Peter, what can I say? We could not have had a better exposition of this whole important field of death and dying. I mean, the work that you're doing to draw attention to this and to do it in practical as well as theoretical ways, I think is of tremendous importance. Thank you for your presentation, thank you for your work, and thank you for your presence here, Peter.